She was just taking a jog. A normal, unremarkable Saturday morning beneath an Arizona sun that hadn't yet burned the desert haze away. 43-year-old Lisa Mancuso laced up her running shoes, slipped in her white earbuds, and set out along Cloud Road, a quiet two-lane stretch winding through New River's tan hills and scattered mesquite. She ran this route often, waving to the same neighbors, timing herself by the same mile marker near 7th Avenue. At 9:58 a.m., that routine shattered. Drivers heading west saw it first. A gray Ford F-250 drifting across the center line. Tires kicking dust. It didn't slow or correct. It simply veered. In the side mirror of one passing SUV, a man caught a flash of motion. Lisa's form, the truck's chrome grille, the sickening impact that followed. Her body was hurled off the shoulder with such force that her shoes were torn from her feet. One landed near a mailbox. The other was found more than 70 feet away. The caller's voice on the 911 recording trembled. She was just taking a jog, and somebody just drove off the side of the road and purposely hit her. That poor kid. I don't think she looked like she had a kid too. Oh my God. He told dispatchers a truck had slowed after the collision, as if the driver were going to stop, then made a U-turn and sped off again. That's the guy who did it. That's the guy who did it, he repeated, breathless, watching in disbelief as the same gray pickup looped back toward the scene before disappearing over the rise. When the first Maricopa County deputy arrived, the sight was devastating. Lisa lay motionless at the edge of the pavement, her phone and earbuds tangled in dust and gravel. A pair of broken eyeglasses glinted nearby. There was nothing to do but check for a pulse and hope for a miracle. None came. At 10:02 a.m., the deputy radioed the words that would rip through a family and, hours later, shake a police department. Victim pronounced deceased. Traffic backed up along Cloud Road as neighbors gathered behind the yellow tape. Someone recognized a distinctive turquoise case of Lisa's phone and whispered her name. Others stared down the highway, still expecting to see flashing lights chasing a fleeing vehicle. None came. The driver was gone, and the only trace left behind was shattered plastic from a headlight and a small smear of paint on the asphalt. Back at the Mancuso home, a text message went unanswered. 10 minutes later, Lisa's husband, Stephen, tried calling. Her phone rang once, twice, and was picked up not by his wife, but by the deputy who had found it. That moment confirmed what no husband should ever have to hear. Within the hour, family members began arriving at the scene. Lisa's father-in-law parked haphazardly near the patrol cars, his voice rising over the wind. "My son just called me. He's crying. He lives right here. Is it her? Is it Lisa?" The deputies tried to keep him back, but grief broke through every line they drew. When the confirmation came, he turned away from the body, hands trembling, whispering, "Oh my God, her poor boy." At home, the couple's young son waited on the porch, confused by the strangers arriving with solemn faces. Stephen sat on the couch beside him, scrolling through their security camera app. He couldn't bring himself to press play. The house, once filled with the smell of coffee and the sound of morning cartoons, fell silent except for the clicking of keys and the muffled sobs of relatives. Meanwhile, detectives combed the roadside for evidence. They measured tire impressions, collected fragments of glass, and bagged the earbuds still tangled around a pebble. The deputy who had knelt beside Lisa stayed there for a long moment after the coroner's van arrived, staring at the spot where her heartbeat had ended. Later, in his report, he would note something unusual. There were no skid marks, no sign the driver even tried to brake. Word of the hit and run spread quickly through the community Facebook groups. Jogger killed near 7th Avenue. Gray Ford pickup wanted. Residents began scanning driveways and parking lots, searching for any truck with front-end damage. Every lead that came in was logged, every photo of a gray pickup scrutinized. Yet by afternoon, investigators still had no license plate and no name. Then came the first break. A homeowner's Ring camera, positioned at a bend just west of the crash, had recorded the moments before the impact. The footage showed Lisa jogging steadily along the shoulder. Seconds later, the 911 caller's SUV passed by. Then came the Ford, rolling through a stop sign, accelerating. The collision itself occurred out of frame, but the microphone caught it. A deep metallic thud, followed by the faint echo of shattering glass. By evening, stills from that footage were circulating across local news broadcasts. Detectives were confident someone would recognize the truck. They didn't expect that recognition to come from inside law enforcement. Sometime after 5 p.m., a call came into the sheriff's office. The dispatcher answered as usual, unaware that the voice on the other end belonged to one of Phoenix's own police lieutenants. "Hi," the man said, steady but heavy. "My name's Benmore. I need to have a deputy dispatched out to me." He hesitated, then continued. "The person that drove my son's truck last night hit a woman on Cloud Road. I just found out about it. The truck's here at my house." The dispatcher asked if his son was present. "He's here," the lieutenant replied quietly. "And I'm a lieutenant with Phoenix PD. I'm not asking for favoritism, but everyone's going to know anyway. It's my son." On the other end of the line, the deputy froze. It was a kind of statement that rearranged everything. A respected officer calling not to protect family, but to turn one in. Back on Cloud Road, investigators still marking evidence had no idea the case had just taken a turn none of them could have predicted. The suspect they were hunting wasn't hiding in the desert or speeding toward another county. He was sitting inside his father's home, unaware that his own parent had picked up the phone and set justice in motion. That night, under the red and blue wash of police lights, one sentence would be repeated again and again, both in disbelief and in relief. That's the guy who did it. And in a small home across Phoenix, a father in uniform stared at his son, the same boy he once taught to tell the truth, and wonder how doing the right thing could feel so unbearable. The morning light still poured through the blinds when the phone rang inside the Mancuso house. Stephen glanced at the clock. 10 a.m. His wife should have been back by now. The run usually took 40 minutes, maybe 45 if she stopped to talk to neighbors. The call wasn't her voice, though. It was a deputy's, steady, official, rehearsing the kind of tragedy that no one is ever truly ready to deliver. He asked for Lisa's husband. Then there was a pause long enough to change a life. Moments later, Stephen was racing out the door, barefoot on the gravel, heading toward Cloud Road. He didn't yet understand that he was moving toward the place his world had just ended. The blue and red lights came into view before he could even see the yellow tape. Officers met him halfway down the road, trying to block his path. He saw the sheet. He didn't need confirmation. Across the street, neighbors stood in silence, clutching coffee cups and phones. A few had recognized a familiar ponytail, the bright tank top she always wore on her morning runs. The disbelief hit first, then the ache. "She was just here yesterday," one woman whispered. She waved. Lisa Mancuso wasn't famous. She didn't make headlines before this day. She was a mother, a wife, a friend, the sort of person everyone describes as kind because she genuinely was. She volunteered at her son's school, coached youth soccer, and ran because it cleared her mind. Every morning, the same route, the same quiet determination. She had planned that afternoon to take her son for ice cream. That's what grief steals. The small, ordinary plans that never seemed important until they disappear. Inside the house, Stephen's father arrived minutes later, chest heaving, face gray with disbelief. "My son just called me," he told an officer at the perimeter. "He said something happened on Cloud Road." The deputy tried to soften it, but the truth hit all the same. "Is it her?" the older man asked. "Is it Lisa?" The officer didn't need to answer. He just lowered his head. "Oh, my God," the man muttered, staggering back toward his truck. "Her poor boy, how am I going to tell him?" Back at the scene, investigators worked methodically. They marked the location of each item thrown from Lisa's body: her earbuds, her shattered glasses, a single running shoe. Evidence technicians measured the distance between them, a grim calculation of impact speed and force. The victim's phone was still intact, locked with passcode, resting just beyond a cracked asphalt seam. When deputies powered it on to search for identification, Stephen's call flashed across the screen. The ringtone echoed over the highway until one of them picked it up. "Sir," the deputy said gently, "where are you right now?" That was the moment the case became personal. Not to the officers, but to everyone who heard the sound of that phone ringing beside the body. Word spread to the neighborhood in waves. By noon, local news outlets were broadcasting from the roadside. The reporter's voice trembled slightly as she described what little they knew. A woman in her 40s struck and killed while jogging near 7th Avenue and Cloud Road. The driver fled the scene. They didn't have her name yet. The family did. Stephen returned home with a deputy trailing him. The blinds were still open, the breakfast dishes still in the sink. Their son looked up from the living room floor where he'd been building with toy blocks. "Where's Mom?" he asked. Stephen knelt down, unable to form the words. The deputy quietly excused himself, closing the front door behind him. In the hours that followed, relatives and friends gathered in the kitchen, murmuring in disbelief. Someone made coffee, but no one drank it. Stephen tried to pull up the security footage from the doorbell camera, hoping to see her leaving the house, maybe to understand how something so ordinary could go so wrong. But the footage cut off after she waved at the camera. The next clip was blank. Their system had glitched the day before. That failure would haunt him for months. Not because it could have stopped what happened, but because it symbolized helplessness. He had no image of her last steps, no sound of her laugh, just silence and still frames. Outside, deputies canvassed the street. Witnesses spoke of a large gray truck speeding away. One driver, who'd been behind Lisa moments earlier, said the truck made 2 U-turns as if deciding whether to return. It looked intentional, he told them. Another thought the driver might have been distracted. Investigators wrote both possibilities down. But every witness agreed on one thing. The truck never braked. The Maricopa County Sheriff's Office began collecting surveillance footage from nearby homes. One camera, mounted high on a stucco wall, captured Lisa's seconds before impact, running steadily, earbuds visible. The truck entered frame only as a blur, but the microphone caught the collision. A heavy metallic thump followed by the faint echo of glass scattering across pavement. That sound became the foundation of the case, the undeniable proof that whatever happened on that road, it was violent, fast, and final. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Stephen sat in his backyard, motionless. His father sat beside him, repeating the same phrase, "This doesn't make sense." Neighbors dropped off food that went untouched. Every time the doorbell rang, Stephen looked up, half expecting Lisa to walk in, apologizing for commotion. Grief distorts time that way. One part of your mind knows she's gone. Another waits for the sound of her keys at the door. That evening, detectives met with the family to collect Lisa's belongings. They returned the phone and the jewelry recovered from the scene. The deputy who'd found her insisted on handing the items to Stephen personally. "She was strong," he said softly. "It was quick. It wasn't comfort, but it was something to hold on to." At the precinct, analysts enhanced the surveillance images, zooming in on the truck's front end. They could make out a partial license plate and distinctive aftermarket headlights. Flyers were prepared, distributed to patrol units, and uploaded to the department's social media page. Within hours, local Facebook groups were flooded with screenshots. "Have you seen this Ford F-250? Dozens of tips poured in, some useless, some promising. Then came the call that none of the investigators expected. It wasn't from a witness or a neighbor. It was from inside law enforcement itself. A Phoenix police lieutenant named Ben Moore had seen the circulating image online. The moment he saw the damage pattern, something inside him shifted. It looked exactly like his son's truck. He walked outside of the driveway, and there it was, the same gray F-250, front left corner crumpled, the headlight shattered. He knelt down and saw what looked like dried biological material near the bumper. He didn't hesitate. He called the sheriff's office. In that instant, the line between duty and blood blurred into something no training manual could cover. He told the dispatcher who he was, what he'd found, and why he was calling. He made it clear he wasn't seeking leniency. He just wanted to do what was right. "It's my son," he said, "and he's here." When detectives at the scene received the message, they stopped what they were doing. Every assumption shifted. The suspect wasn't some faceless stranger. They now had a name, an address, and a connection that would test the integrity of everyone involved. Back in New River, the last of the evidence markers were collected. The desert was growing cold. A deputy placed a bouquet someone had left near the skidless patch of asphalt. a cluster of sunflowers from a neighbor's yard. As he drove away, his radio crackled with the new dispatch information. The killer's truck had been found. The address belonged to a Phoenix police officer. And the call that broke the case didn't come from a tip line or forensic lab. It came from a father who could have stayed silent, but didn't. By nightfall, two families on opposite sides of tragedy sat awake, staring at the same sky, one asking why, the other asking what now. The next morning would bring detectives to the lieutenant's doorstep, a truck wrapped in evidence tape, and the young man inside the house who claimed he couldn't remember a thing. But for the family on Cloud Road, there was only absence, the sound of a phone ringing where a heartbeat used to be. The day after Lisa Mancuso's death began like any other Arizona morning. The sky flawless, the air deceptively still. But inside the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office, the mood was anything but calm. Deputies were hunched over monitors, rewinding and replaying grainy home surveillance footage. Somewhere in the desert sprawl of Phoenix, a truck with a broken headlight was hiding in plain sight. The partial license plate they gathered wasn't enough for a clean match, but the frame of the truck, a gray Ford F-250 Super Duty, was distinct. It had chrome side mirrors and an aftermarket black bumper, with a dent near the left corner. Investigators believed the vehicle would have front-end damage and possibly traces of biological material from the collision. At first, they thought it would take days to find it. They were wrong. By mid-afternoon, the sheriff's public information officer posted still images from a nearby Ring camera, a gray Ford pickup, rolling through a stop sign seconds before the impact that killed Lisa. Within minutes, the post went viral across community groups. Tips poured in, addresses, license numbers, even blurry photos of trucks spotted at gas stations. At 5:32 p.m., a call came in that made everyone in the operations room go silent. "Hi," the caller began evenly. "My name's Ben Moore. I need to have a deputy dispatched out to me." There was a pause, the kind that makes dispatchers reach for a notepad. "The person that drove my son's truck last night hit a woman on Cloud Road. I just found out about it. I'm a lieutenant with Phoenix PD, and it's my son." The room froze. A law enforcement officer was reporting his own child for vehicular homicide. The dispatcher handled it by the book. Tone neutral, questions precise. Where was the truck? Was the son home? Did anyone else drive it? Lieutenant Moore answered methodically. Yes, the truck was parked on the side of his house. Yes, his son was inside. No, there had been no cover-up. "I'm not asking for favoritism," he added quietly. "Everyone's going to know anyway." For a man who'd spent decades enforcing the law, the next steps must have felt like walking through quicksand. He had commanded Phoenix's Vehicular Crimes Unit for nearly 4 years. He had made hundreds of next-of-kin notifications, told dozens of families that their loved one was never coming home. But nothing could prepare him for being on the other side of that conversation. Deputies dispatched to the lieutenant's address approached the home cautiously. The suburban driveway looked ordinary. 2 cars, a basketball hoop, the faint smell of desert rain. But the gray F-250 told a different story. Its front left corner was crumpled, the headlight shattered, a dull streak across the chrome catching the last rays of the sun. Lieutenant Moore was waiting outside, hands on his hips, shoulders sagging under the weight of what he'd already done. "This is it," he told them, nodding toward the truck. "I didn't touch it. You'll see what you need to see." The deputies took photographs, the missing glass, the dent pattern, and a faint residue that might be blood. They noted that the vehicle's usual parking spot, along the opposite side of the house, was empty. "It's never parked over here," Moore said. "That's how I knew something was wrong." Inside the house, Jacob Moore, 20 years old, sat on the couch, pale and silent. His father had already told him what happened. The boy's eyes were red but dry, as if the shock had drained every tear before it could fall. "He doesn't remember," his father said quietly. "He says he woke up in bed this morning with no idea how he got home." The deputies advised that Jacob shouldn't make any statements without counsel. Moore nodded, his instincts as both a parent and a police officer aligning for once. "He'll cooperate," he promised. "We're just waiting for his attorney to call me back. I want to do this right." As detectives began their preliminary examination, they noticed empty beer cans in a garbage bin beside the garage. freshly discarded, the metal still carrying condensation. Moore admitted he'd thrown them away earlier, long before realizing connection. Could have been protein shakes, could have been Coors Light, he said grimly. I didn't know what I was looking at yet. Back at headquarters, the revelation sent ripples through both departments. It wasn't just another hit and run anymore. It was a test of integrity. The suspect was the son of a respected officer, and the man who had just cracked the case was that officer himself. Detective notes from that evening described the lieutenant as cooperative, forthcoming, and visibly shaken. He escorted investigators around the property, provided home security footage, and even pointed out that the truck's bed appeared recently rearranged. It was as if he were trying to solve the crime and confess at the same time. Meanwhile, witnesses continued to give statements at the sheriff's substation. One said the truck seemed to swerve deliberately, another that it just drifted. But one detail united them all. The truck had returned to the scene twice before fleeing for good. If he thought he hit a box or a sign, one deputy remarked, "Why turn around?" When detectives asked Lieutenant Moore about possible other drivers, he mentioned a name he'd only just learned from his son, Jenica. Jacob had been out with friends the night before, including 2 young women. One, he claimed, had driven his truck because he was too intoxicated. The lieutenant repeated what Jacob told him. He said he passed out, that she dropped him off. That's all he knows. But something about the timeline didn't sit right. The impact had occurred around 10 a.m., broad daylight, hours after the supposed handoff. If Jacob was truly asleep at home, who had been driving his truck at that moment, detectives didn't have the answer yet. But they did have evidence. The damaged F-250, the beer cans, and a father's recorded phone call admitting what most would try to hide. Before leaving the property, one deputy turned to the lieutenant. "Sir," he said carefully, "this is going to raise a lot of questions. About conflict of interest, about the chain of evidence." Moore cut him off with a weary nod. "I know. I've already thought of all of it. I'm not protecting anybody. I just want to make sure no one can ever say I didn't do the right thing." As the evidence truck rolled away with the Ford on its flatbed, neighbors peeked through blinds, their whispers weaving a mixture of pity and shock. News spread quickly. The hit-and-run suspect was the son of a Phoenix police lieutenant. Inside the house, Jacob sat alone, staring at his hands. His father lingered near the window, watching the red taillights disappear down the street. After 26 years in uniform, he had believed he'd seen everything. Gang shootings, fatal DUIs, wrong-way crashes on I-17. But he'd never imagined this. The crime scene roped off in his own driveway, the paperwork bearing his last name. For investigators, the moral weight was palpable. They'd seen plenty of families fractured by tragedy, but rarely one divided by both justice and blood. Still, the facts were what mattered, and the facts were beginning to harden. The pattern of the dent, the shattered glass, the timeline, it all pointed in one direction. Later that night, in a small interview room downtown, a senior deputy summed up what everyone was thinking. "In 26 years, I've never had to tell a man who wears our badge that the killer he's helping us catch is his own child. But here we are." Lieutenant Moore didn't argue. He simply nodded, exhausted. "Just make sure we get it right," he said. "That's all I care about." By midnight, the case that had started with a jogger and a fleeing truck had become something larger, a test of conscience that blurred the line between duty and love. The public didn't know it yet, but the most crucial evidence wouldn't come from the truck's broken headlight or the scene itself. It would come from a small cafe camera, hours earlier, showing who really sat behind the wheel before the sun climbed high over Cloud Road. That footage would soon answer every question and destroy any illusion that the crash was a mystery. By dawn the next day, the story had broken. Phoenix Police Lieutenant's son investigated in deadly hit-and-run. The headlines spread like wildfire across Arizona feeds. Inside the Moore household, blinds were drawn, phones silenced. Outside, unmarked cars waited along the curb while detectives conferred quietly with a man who had placed a call that stunned 2 departments. Lieutenant Ben Moore looked years older than he had the night before. His uniform jacket hung untouched on a chair. He hadn't slept. The badge that once defined him now felt like evidence of a life divided, half law, half fatherhood. He met the lead investigator on the porch. "Everything you need is yours," he said simply. "Cameras, phone records, whatever you want." The deputy nodded and followed him inside. The air smelled faintly of coffee and motor oil. In the corner of the living room sat Jacob Moore, 20 years old, head in his hands. His attorney was on the way, but his father stayed close, pacing the edge of the room like a man guarding two worlds that could no longer coexist. Jacob had spent the previous evening in stunned silence. When the reality of Lisa Mancuso's death finally pierced through the fog, he whispered, "I don't remember any of it." To the investigators, that sounded less like denial than damage, the kind of blackout that follows hours of drinking. But memory loss doesn't erase responsibility, and everyone in the room knew it. Detectives began retracing Jacob's final 24 hours before the crash. His phone record showed a trail through Phoenix nightlife, texts arranging meetups, timestamps from bars, and then a cluster of photos around 8 a.m. from a cafe called Heart and Soul. Surveillance video confirmed it. The same gray Ford F-250 pulling into the parking lot, Jacob stumbling out, followed by his friends Kyle, Jackson, and two women later identified as Jenica and Micah. In the footage, Jacob's balance wavered. His eyes half closed as he leaned on a chair. The waitress told police later that she'd stopped serving alcohol after watching the group order screwdrivers one after another. They were loud, dropping profanity, calling each other names. She recalled, "I started giving them just orange juice." The timestamp, 8:27 a.m., barely an hour and a half before Lisa Mancuso began her run. Jenica appeared sober. When the group left, she took Jacob's keys and slid into the driver's seat. Cameras captured Jacob slumped against the passenger door, head in her lap, eyes shut. They drove away slowly, sunlight bouncing off the windshield. What happened next would become the central dispute of the investigation. Jenica later told detectives she pulled over after Jacob grew angry, insisting he take back the wheel. "He started yelling," she said. "He said, 'It's my pickup, let me drive.' I didn't want to argue, so I got out." According to her, she left him behind at a friend's house and rode back to campus with Micah. Jacob, she claimed, was tired but conscious, saying only that he wanted to go home. The timestamps aligned almost perfectly with a collision on Cloud Road. 10 minutes separated Jacob leaving that driveway and Lisa's final steps. At the sheriff's office, investigators assembled a wall of evidence. On one side, images of Lisa's running route, the ring camera stills, the debris field. On the other, a timeline of the group's morning, each clip and statement pinned beneath a clock face. The arcs converged at 9:59 a.m. Back at the Moore home, the lieutenant watched the process unfold with grim familiarity. He had built walls like that himself, arranging victims and suspects until a story took shape. Now his son's photo was at the center. "If I hadn't called," he told one detective quietly, "someone else would have, and then they'd say I hid it." The deputy didn't respond. There was nothing to add. By mid-morning, forensic technicians arrived to process the truck more thoroughly. They swabbed the front bumper and the shattered headlight, dusted for fingerprints, and cataloged every mark. Inside the cab, they found a faint smear on the steering wheel, later confirmed as Jacob's DNA, and traces of Lisa Mancuso's blood beneath the fractured headlight lens. The case that had teetered on doubt was now anchored in science. While samples were sent to the state lab, deputies interviewed Jacob's friend Jackson, who'd stayed behind at the cafe. He confirmed the drinking, the fatigue, and the argument about driving. "He shouldn't have been behind the wheel," Jackson said flatly. "He was gone." When detectives relayed the findings to Lieutenant Moore, he sat motionless for a long time. "He'll have to face it," he said finally. "But I'll be there." It wasn't a declaration of innocence. It was acceptance. Later that afternoon, social media swarmed. Screenshots of the truck in his driveway appeared alongside the phrase, "Blue wall protecting its own." Comment threads ignited with accusations of favoritism. The sheriff's office quickly released a statement confirming the lieutenant's cooperation and stressing that Phoenix PD had been walled off from the investigation. Still, the optics were brutal. A cop's son, a dead jogger, and a father wearing the same badge as the officers collecting his evidence. That night, the lieutenant met privately with the lead investigator. Their conversation, later summarized in court documents, was short and raw. The detective thanked him for coming forward. Moore shook his head. "You're thanking me for the worst thing I've ever had to do," he said. "If he'd killed a stranger, I'd be here anyway. I just never imagined a stranger would have a name, a husband, a kid." When Jacob's attorney arrived, questioning paused. The young man agreed to cooperate through counsel. The next morning, he surrendered voluntarily at the Maricopa County Jail. Booking photos showed a pale, hollow-eyed defendant, not a hardened criminal, but a cautionary figure. The official charge sheet listed manslaughter and leaving the scene of an accident involving death. For Ben Moore, the following days blurred together. Departmental interviews, ethics reviews, sleepless nights. Colleagues sent messages of support mixed with unease. One captain texted, "You did what you had to. Not everyone would have." He didn't reply. Weeks later, when the DNA report arrived, it confirmed what everyone suspected. Lisa Mancuso's biological material on the truck's headlight, Jacob's fingerprints on the steering wheel. The narrative was complete, and it was undeniable. Yet the moral center of the story remained that phone call, the moment a veteran officer put truth above blood. To investigators, it represented integrity. To the Mancuso family, it was a turning point that ensured justice wouldn't drown in politics. And to Ben Moore himself, it was both salvation and punishment. Late one evening, standing in his driveway, he looked at the empty space where the truck had been. The asphalt still bore faint tire marks from the tow. He thought of Lisa Mancuso's husband, of the child she left behind. Then he thought of his own son, now sitting in a holding cell miles away. The silence between those two worlds felt endless. When reporters later asked how he could turn in his own child, he answered with a line that defined the entire tragedy. Because someone else's child didn't come home. The father's duty had collided with the son's secret, and in doing so, had revealed the rarest thing in police work, a story where the truth, no matter how devastating, was still told. Every tragedy begins long before anyone realizes it. For Lisa Mancuso, the countdown started the night before a run, hours before dawn, when the city lights of Phoenix shimmered against the desert and laughter echoed from a small group of friends who thought they were invincible. Jacob Moore, 20 years old, was one of them, the son of a decorated Phoenix police lieutenant. He had grown up around rules, discipline, and the sharp edge of consequence. But on that February night in 2024, none of that mattered. He was just another young man out with friends, moving through the city's nightlife, unaware that a single decision would end a life by morning. The group's evening began at a local bar, then stretched into the early hours at an abandoned racetrack outside town. It was a kind of place where the noise didn't reach anyone, where headlights carved circles in the dirt and bottles clinked against truck beds. According to witnesses, they brought a 12-pack of beer and finished most of it. Kyle, one of Jacob's friends, later said it was probably 3 beers each, maybe more. The empties were tossed into the back of Jacob's Ford F-250, a habit no one thought twice about. By 6 a.m., hunger replaced excitement. Someone mentioned breakfast, and they settled on a cafe called Heart and Soul, a quiet spot popular with locals on weekend mornings. It was supposed to be routine, eggs, coffee, a chance to shake off the night before. Instead, the security footage from that cafe would later become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the case. At 8:05 a.m., Jacob's gray truck pulled into the parking lot. He stepped out first, unsteady, dragging his feet. The waitress remembered him as pale and glassy-eyed. His speech blurred. His friends, Kyle Jackson, and 2 young women, Jenica and Micah, followed behind. The girls were in their early 20s, college students who had agreed to drive, because the men were too drunk to function. Inside, they ordered screwdrivers, vodka mixed with orange juice, even though the morning light through the windows made the drinks look almost absurd. The waitress recalled feeling uneasy. She watched Jacob rest his head on the table, eyes half closed. When he became loud and started using profanity, she stopped serving alcohol altogether. "I gave them just juice after that," she said later. He looked done. Around 8:30, Jacob slumped sideways, his head falling into Jenica's lap. When the group stood to leave, she took his keys. "He's tired," she told the waitress, and everyone nodded. It seemed harmless at the time, just one friend making sure another didn't drive. Outside, Jenica got behind the wheel of Jacob's truck, and Micah followed in another vehicle. They drove toward Anthem, planning to drop Jacob and Kyle at a friend's house before heading home. For a few miles, everything went as planned. Jacob was quiet, drowsy, staring out the window. But as they neared the turnoff, the situation shifted. Jenica later told detectives that Jacob suddenly snapped awake, shouting. He accused her of missing a turn, insisted on taking back the wheel. "It's my truck," he said. She tried to calm him down, but eventually pulled over, tired of arguing. He climbed into the driver's seat, and she walked to the passenger side. She said she didn't want to be in the vehicle anymore. A nearby house camera captured what happened next. The truck arrived in a friend's driveway. Doors opened, Jacob and Jenica stepped out. They stood talking for 2 minutes. He hugged her, then climbed back into the driver's seat. She walked toward Micah's car, waiting nearby. The truck rolled away at 9:49 a.m. Jacob was alone. 9 minutes later, on Cloud Road, Lisa Mancuso began her morning jog. Investigators would later piece together the sequence down to the minute. The timeline was devastating in its clarity. 8 o'clock, alcohol in the cafe. 9:40, seat swap confirmed. 9:49, truck leave the driveway. 9:58, impact. The footage left little room for interpretation. For detectives, this wasn't just an accident. It was a slow-motion chain reaction of arrogance, exhaustion, and neglect. Jacob wasn't a hardened criminal. He was a young man who made one catastrophic choice, to drive when he shouldn't have. When Lieutenant Ben Moore watched the surveillance video for the first time, he didn't move for a long time. The man on the screen looked barely conscious, but there was no mistaking who he was. It was his son. He had spent years teaching new recruits how to investigate fatal crashes caused by impaired driving. Now his own family had become the case study. Across town, the Mancuso family held a vigil near the spot where Lisa had fallen. Friends placed purple flowers by the roadside, her favorite color. Her husband stood beside their young son, who didn't yet understand why everyone was crying. For him, his mother's daily jog had simply never ended. The investigation pressed forward. Detectives discovered that hours after the crash, Jacob had searched DUI manslaughter Arizona sentence on his phone. 10 minutes later, his father made the call that would make headlines across the state. Later that same afternoon, Jacob texted a friend, "I might be going away." Those digital fingerprints erased all doubt. They showed consciousness, fear, and guilt. They proved that somewhere in that haze of alcohol and confusion, he understood what had happened. The evidence was overwhelming. Lisa's DNA found on the shattered headlight. Jacob's fingerprints on the steering wheel. The truck's onboard computer registering a sharp deceleration consistent with a body impact. By the time detectives finished, there was no version of events where Jacob wasn't responsible. On March 18, 2024, he surrendered voluntarily, his father by his side. The mugshot released that afternoon showed a young man hollowed out by shock and remorse. There were no protests, no excuses, only a quiet acceptance that the world he knew had ended. The case moved through the courts over the following year. In April 2025, Jacob pleaded guilty to manslaughter and leaving the scene of an accident resulting in death. He was sentenced 2 months later to 4 years in the Arizona Department of Corrections, followed by 3 years of supervised probation and restitution to Lisa Mancuso's family. It was a measured sentence, lenient by some standards, severe by others. But for everyone involved, there was no true victory. Lisa was gone. Jacob's life was permanently altered. And Ben Moore, once known as one of Phoenix's most respected lieutenants, would forever be remembered as the father who picked up the phone and did what was right. When asked later why he had reported his own son, he answered without hesitation, "Because another man's wife didn't come home. Because another child lost a parent." That's what the badge means. The night before it became more than a timeline, it was a mirror reflecting every choice that led to tragedy. 2 families were left staring into that reflection, one mourning what was taken, the other mourning what they had given away. And in between them stood a man who understood that duty and love are not opposites, but the same truth carried on different shoulders. The courtroom was cold the morning Jacob Moore stood to face judgment. The sound of shuffling papers filled the air as reporters adjusted their cameras, and the families of both victim and defendant settled into opposite rows. The headline had already been written: "Officer's son pleads guilty in fatal hit-and-run." Yet, for everyone inside, the moment felt smaller, quieter, heavier than any headline could capture. Jacob looked older than 21. His hair was trimmed short, his face pale and tired. When he rose before the judge, his father stood behind him, the same man who had picked up the phone a year earlier to report what no parent should ever have to say. There was no uniform on him now, no badge, only the look of someone who understood that duty and heartbreak can sometimes mean the same thing. Lisa Mancuso's family filled the first two benches on the left. Her husband, Stephen, sat straight-backed, his hands folded tightly in his lap. Their son sat beside him, head bowed. On the floor beneath their bench was a pair of running shoes, Lisa's shoes, carefully cleaned, tied together, and carried with them wherever they went. It was a symbol, not of the day she died, but of how she lived. The judge reviewed the plea agreement. One count of manslaughter, one count of leaving the scene of an accident resulting in death. The recommendation was 4 years in the Arizona Department of Corrections, 3 years of supervised probation, and full restitution to the Mancuso family. When asked if he wished to speak, Jacob's voice cracked. "There isn't a day I don't think about what I did," he said. "If I could change places with her, I would. I'm sorry to her family, to my family, to everyone who has to live with this because of me." There was no applause, no outburst, only silence, the kind that carries more weight than any words. Outside, cameras waited for the statement everyone knew was coming. Stephen stood before them, his voice steady, the strength of a man who had lost everything but refused to let bitterness be the last word. "Lisa was loved," he said. "She ran because it made her feel alive. I hope no other family ever has to stand where we're standing. And I hope he remembers her name every day of his sentence." A few feet away, Lieutenant Ben Moore faced the same cameras. His eyes were tired, his expression controlled but raw beneath the surface. "I made the call because it was the right thing to do," he said quietly. "No one is above the law, not even my family. I wear the same badge today I wore that morning, and it means the same thing, to protect the innocent even when it hurts." The two men, one who had lost his wife, one who had turned his son, stood only yards apart, bound by the same truth. No justice can ever undo what's been done. When the sentencing concluded on June 11th, 2025, Jacob was led from the courtroom in handcuffs. He nodded once toward his father before the deputies guided him through the door. His sentence, 4 years, was short enough that he'd still have a life to return to. For Lisa, there would be no return. That disparity lingered in the air long after the gavel fell. In the months that followed, both families lived under the weight of public scrutiny. For the Mancusos, grief took the shape of advocacy. They founded the Lisa Mancuso Memorial Run, a 5K charity event supporting victims of impaired driving. On its first anniversary, hundreds gathered along Cloud Road, wearing purple ribbons, Lisa's favorite color. Her husband and son led the first mile together, running in silence except for the rhythmic sound of sneakers striking pavement. For the Moores, the aftermath was quieter. The lieutenant kept working, though friends said his demeanor had changed. He no longer lectured about accountability. He embodied it. Colleagues described a man still carrying the heaviness of a decision that defined him. "He's the most honest cop I know," one officer said. "He did what every parent hopes they'd never have to." Inside the Arizona Department of Corrections, Jacob spent his days in a small, cinder-block cell. He earned his GED, attended alcohol awareness programs, and wrote letters that were never mailed. To his father, he wrote, "I used to think courage was running toward danger. Now I think it's facing what you've done." The case faded from headlines, but not from memory. For investigators, it became a training example, a rare instance of transparency in a case that could have easily been buried. For the public, it was a reminder that integrity doesn't depend on status. For Lisa's community, it became a ritual of remembrance. On the 1-year anniversary of her death, the early morning air over New River felt the same as it had that morning she left home for the last time. The road was lined with people holding purple balloons. Stephen stood near the starting line, holding his son's hand. At exactly 10:02 a.m., the minute she had been pronounced dead, the crowd fell silent. Then the race began. As the runners took off, the sound of their footsteps rolled like a wave down Cloud Road. Some cried quietly. Others smiled through the tears. It wasn't about finishing first. It was about remembering a life lived fully, cut short by someone else's moment of recklessness. Reporters later asked Stephen if forgiveness was possible. He paused before answering. "Forgiveness isn't about letting go," he said. "It's about not letting one tragedy take two families." That statement echoed across news stations that night. It was both grace and indictment, an understanding that while punishment ends, loss never does. By the time Jacob's sentence was announced publicly, social media had moved on to the next story. The world forgets quickly. But in two homes in Arizona, one in New River and one in Phoenix, the ripple of that February morning never stopped moving. One family kept Lisa's medals hanging by the door. The other kept a folded court document inside a Bible. Both served as reminders of the same lesson. Truth has a cost, but silence costs more. When the sun set on Cloud Road that anniversary evening, the light turned gold over the desert brush. A gentle wind moved through the same stretch of asphalt where Lisa had last run. There were no sirens now, no evidence markers, just a faint echo of sneakers on pavement and the promise of remembrance. For Lieutenant Ben Moore, it was a sound of consequence and courage colliding, the proof that even when justice breaks your heart, it still matters. And for everyone who followed the story, it remained a single unshakable image, a copper phone in his hand, his voice trembling as he said the words that defined the entire case. "It's my son." That confession ended a search, began an investigation, and became a symbol of what integrity truly looks like when there's nothing left to protect but the truth itself.